August, 1943. The skies above the Solomon Islands burned like torn parchment. Each sunrise began with the smell of salt, oil, and death, and each sunset swallowed another name, another memory. The Marines called it the meat grinder. To the enemy, it was sacred ground. But to one man, it became a proving ground, a place where survival demanded something beyond courage, something closer to madness. His name was Sergeant Daniel "Hawk" Hensley. 23 years old. A farm boy from Kansas who had never seen the ocean before the war, and now, every day, he flew above it, trying not to die in it. That he was part of a small air group stationed on Henderson Field, a battered strip of mud and wreckage carved out of Guadalcanal's jungle. The place shook under the weight of mosquitoes, humidity, and the constant drone of Japanese bombers. The squadron was down to half strength. Spare parts were scarce, ammo was rationed, and the enemy seemed endless. But the true terror wasn't the planes above, it was the helplessness below. Daniel flew a Vought F4U Corsair, a beast of steel and rage. Its .50 caliber Browning machine gun spat fury at 800 rounds per minute, but lately, even fury wasn't enough. Japanese Zeros came in swarms. Light, fast, agile, ghosts in the sunlight. And every encounter ended with another Corsair spiraling into the sea. On one blistering afternoon, Daniel's commanding officer, Captain Weller, slammed his fist against a crate of empty ammo belts. "We can't keep trading one plane for three," he growled. "We need an edge, or we're finished." Daniel listened, eyes fixed on the smoking wreckage of a downed Corsair outside the hangar. Its guns had jammed mid-flight. The pilot hadn't stood a chance. That night, while others tried to sleep through the mosquito drone, Daniel sat by the remains of the wreck. He studied the guns, their mounts, their feed system, the way they overheated and choked under pressure. He wasn't a trained engineer. Just a pilot with grease-stained hands and a stubborn streak. But as the jungle whispered in the dark, an idea began to take form, something insane, something no manual would ever approve. He scavenged spare parts from wrecked aircraft, feeding belts from a P-40, cooling vents from a grounded B-17, and the trigger assembly from a wrecked twin-engine bomber. Piece by piece, he started building his own modification. A system that would push the Corsair's guns far beyond their intended limits. The mechanics thought he'd lost it, overclocking the Brownings. "You'll blow the barrels clean off," one of them said. Daniel just smirked. "Maybe. Or maybe we'll finally even the odds." For days, he worked under the canvas of a repair tent, hands trembling from exhaustion and coffee. Sweat soaked through his flight suit as he rewired the gun synchronizers and adjusted the feed belts. He didn't just want speed, he wanted sustain. By the time he was done, his Corsair's guns weren't standard anymore. They were monsters. .6 Brownings, linked through a modified feed chain that could cycle nearly 1,200 rounds per minute, with a new cooling vent that bled steam from the gun cowling like a locomotive. When he fired them for the first time, the sound shattered the morning silence. The entire airstrip turned to look. Even the ground crew ducked. It wasn't a staccato burst anymore, it was a continuous scream of lead, and when it stopped, there was nothing left of the target but dust and shredded earth. "Jesus Christ," Captain Weller whispered, staring at the smoking barrels. "What the hell did you build?" Daniel grinned, hands shaking. "Something that might just keep us alive." But power came with a price. Each burst drained the ammo belts like water through a sieve. Every second meant hundreds of rounds, and the barrels warped under the heat. Still, in the Pacific, survival was measured in seconds. And if you could kill 20 men in one of them, maybe that was enough. The next morning, Daniel took off for his first mission with the modified guns. Clouds hung low, and the ocean glimmered beneath him like glass. The radio crackled, "Enemy formation inbound, 30 miles north." They met over a chain of small islands, sunlight flashing off wings, engines screaming in the sky. The first Zero came in from the sun, diving fast. Daniel rolled, fired, and the world erupted. His Corsair roared like thunder, the gun spewing a storm of tracer fire so dense it looked like molten rain. The Zero disintegrated mid-air, wings torn off, the cockpit engulfed. A second came up behind him. Daniel rolled hard, flipped the Corsair over, and unleashed another burst. The modified guns sang their deadly tune, and within seconds, the sky was filled with falling fire. "God damn it, Hawk," came Weller's voice over the radio. "You just melted through half your ammo." Daniel laughed through gritted teeth. "Then I'll make the last half count." For the next 3 minutes, the air battle became chaos, a maelstrom of smoke and burning aluminum. Daniel's guns didn't jam once. Every pull of the trigger turned enemy fighters into falling comets. 20, maybe more, all downed in minutes. When the smoke cleared, the sky was empty. Daniel's Corsair drifted through silence, wings streaked with soot, guns glowing orange. He looked down at the ocean, littered with debris, oil, and the faint outline of parachutes sinking beneath the waves. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He just stared, because in that silence, he understood what his creation had done, and what it had cost. Back at Henderson Field, the ground crew met him with cheers. But Weller saw the look in his eyes, the same haunted, hollow stare shared by men who had seen too much. That night, Daniel sat by his plane, staring at the barrels. They were warped, scorched, still smoking. He whispered to himself, 20 a minute, and still not enough. In the jungle beyond the airstrip, the cicadas sang, and somewhere, in the darkness, the war sang back. Night on Guadalcanal wasn't quiet, it just hid its noise beneath the surface. The air hummed with distant artillery. Crickets chirped from somewhere deep in the jungle, their rhythm broken by the cough of diesel engines and the metallic groan of repair crews working through exhaustion. Sergeant Daniel Hawk Hensley sat by his Corsair, sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow. The barrels of his machine gun still glowed faintly from the day's slaughter, like the embers of a dying forge. He could still hear them, the screams of metal tearing, the brief radio bursts before silence swallowed them whole. He told himself he'd done what he had to. But the truth was harder to live with than the enemy's bullets. Captain Weller found him sitting there, a flask of black coffee in one hand and a cleaning rod in the other. "You're supposed to be sleeping," Weller said, lighting a cigarette, the flame illuminating the scars on his face. "Can't," Daniel muttered. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them. Those planes. Those men." Weller exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "They'd have done the same to you. You know that." Daniel nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on the barrels. "I just thought, maybe it'd feel like victory." Weller sighed. "Out here, victory's just a word we use so we don't go insane." The next morning, news arrived from command. Japanese forces were regrouping near Kolombangara, launching nightly raids against supply convoys. Losses were mounting. The message was simple: hold the line. No retreat. Daniel's modified Corsair had already become a rumor among pilots. They called it the Devil's Breath. Word spread of a Marine who could tear through a formation faster than anti-aircraft fire, a man who had turned his plane into a flying saw blade. But the brass wasn't pleased. 2 officers arrived from the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, stiff, sunburned men with clean uniforms and sharper tongues. They inspected the Corsair like surgeons examining a body. "This weapon modification," one of them said, "isn't sanctioned. It's a mechanical hazard and a disciplinary offense." Weller bristled. "It's saving lives. It's breaking regulations," the officer snapped back. Then he turned to Daniel. "You'll remove it. Effective immediately." Daniel didn't answer. He just stared at the man, the kind of stare that comes from too many funerals. Later that night, while the officers slept in their tents, Daniel went back to work. Under the dim glow of a hurricane lamp, he disassembled the guns, polished the barrels, replaced a cracked feed belt, and tuned the vent system to perfection. That if they wanted him to stop, they'd have to ground him themselves. The next day brought rain, thick, choking sheets that turned the airfield into a swamp. Japanese bombers used the storm for cover. Sirens wailed, mechanics scattered, and engines roared to life. Daniel sprinted for his Corsair, mud splashing against his legs. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" a mechanic yelled. "Up," Daniel barked. "Where else?" Visibility was nearly zero. Clouds hung so low they brushed the treetops. Daniel's squadron broke through the mist like shadows, climbing toward the sound of approaching engines. Then, the sky opened. Black silhouettes of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers filled the air, escorted by a swarm of Zeros. "Here we go," Daniel whispered. His thumb pressed the trigger. The modified gun screamed again, louder, faster, deadlier than before. Tracer fire ripped through the rain, slicing through bomber wings like lightning. The formation broke apart in panic. 1, 2, 3 planes exploded, raining burning fuel into the sea below. Devil's breath is airborne, a pilot shouted over the radio. Holy hell, he's chewing them up. But victory came with its toll. The new barrels overheated faster in the humid air. One gun jammed, another cracked. A burst of return fire tore through Daniel's right wing, shredding the control cables. The Corsair shuddered violently. Come on, hold together, he growled. Not now. A Zero dove at him head-on. Daniel waited until it was almost suicidal to fire, then squeezed the trigger. The guns erupted, point blank. The Zero disintegrated in a flash of orange light, fragments slamming against his canopy, but one shard pierced through, slicing a thin line across Daniel's cheek. He didn't flinch, blood mixed with sweat, his hands slick on the stick. The radio crackled again. Hensley, break off. You're overheating. Daniel ignored it. He kept firing, kept climbing, until the last bomber was nothing but falling wreckage. When he finally turned back toward Henderson Field, smoke trailed from his right wing, fuel leaked from a dozen bullet holes. That he was running on fumes and stubbornness. The landing was rough. The Corsair hit the mud, bounced, and nearly veered off the strip before settling. The mechanics ran toward him, shouting. Weller followed close behind. Daniel climbed out slowly, helmet off, face streaked with oil and blood. You disobeyed a direct order, Weller said. Daniel's voice was calm. And saved the convoy. The brass didn't see it that way. That evening, Daniel was called into the officer's tent. The men inside wore clean collars and cold expressions. Sergeant Hensley, one said, your modifications have violated marine regulations and endangered government property. You're grounded until further notice. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, saluted, and walked out. Outside, the night had fallen again, heavy and still. The jungle hissed softly under the rain. That he looked back toward the airstrip, where his Corsair sat in the dark, its guns covered, silent. For the first time since the war began, Daniel felt something colder than fear, uselessness. But war has a way of finding the ones who try to walk away. 3 nights later, a Japanese flotilla launched a surprise attack. Shells rained down on Henderson Field, turning the runway into molten earth. Pilots scrambled, some barefoot. As explosions tore through the tents, Daniel ran through the chaos, searching for Weller. That he found him near the command hut, shouting into a field radio, we're blind. No air cover. They're cutting us to pieces. Daniel grabbed his arm. Let me take her up. You're grounded. Then court-martial me later. Weller hesitated, then threw him the keys. Go. And make it count. Daniel sprinted through falling debris, climbed into the Corsair, and fired the engine to life. Flames reflected off the wet metal as he roared down what was left of the runway. As he lifted off, a shell exploded behind him, swallowing the airstrip in fire. Through the smoke and chaos, he climbed higher, into the night. Below, the island burned. Above, the stars vanished behind clouds. That he could see the enemy ships on the horizon, dark silhouettes moving like sharks in the moonlight. That he checked his ammo, half load, cooling vents damaged, and yet, he smiled, because this was where he belonged. He banked the Corsair toward the fleet, the ocean glimmering below like black glass. The first anti-aircraft bursts flashed in the distance, tracing his path in arcs of fire. Daniel took a deep breath and whispered, let's see if you still remember how to sing. He pressed the trigger. The devil's breath roared to life once more, tearing through the dark, painting the sky with fire. The night sky above the Pacific was alive, not with stars, but with fire. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness like red comets, and the ocean below reflected every explosion like shattered glass. Daniel, Hawk, Hensley's Corsair cut through the chaos, its engine howling in protest, its 6 modified Browning screaming louder than thunder. He dove low over the waves, skimming the surface to avoid the searchlights that swept like hungry eyes from the Japanese fleet below. Every flash of light revealed the monstrous shapes of enemy cruisers and destroyers, their guns thundering, sending plumes of water and steel into the air. Come on, he muttered, gripping the stick. The cockpit rattled, gauges flickering from the shockwaves of nearby shells. His target was the lead destroyer, a long, dark silhouette slicing through the Black Sea. He angled the Corsair upward, lined up the shot, and pressed the trigger. The modified Brownings came alive. The sound wasn't gunfire. It was a mechanical scream, a chorus of pure destruction. Rounds tore into the destroyer's deck, shredding its gunners, ripping apart fuel drums and ammunition crates. A chain of explosions followed. Bright, violent, endless, the destroyer vanished in a fireball that lit the sea for miles. Daniel's Corsair shook from the blast as debris clanged against the fuselage that he pulled up, breath ragged, heart hammering. From the radio came Weller's voice, distant, broken through static. "Hensley, you insane son of a bitch, you actually did it." Daniel didn't respond. His focus locked on the remaining ships. 2 more destroyers were turning their guns toward him. He dove again, weaving through the rain of tracer fire. The ocean erupted around him, geysers of seawater drenching his canopy. His left wing clipped a burst of shrapnel, warning lights flashed, metal groaned. He fired again. Another burst. Another explosion. Each second felt like an hour, each breath, a fight against gravity, heat, and terror, but the modified guns were reaching their limit. The barrels glowed red-hot, venting smoke through cracked cooling lines. A smell of burnt oil filled the cockpit. Still, Daniel held the trigger. The final rounds left the barrels in a continuous roar, and the second destroyer erupted in flames, its ammunition stores detonating in a chain reaction that tore the ship in half. The third destroyer retreated, engines roaring, the crew abandoning their stations in panic. Daniel exhaled slowly, pulling back on the stick. He had done it. Alone. One plane against a fleet, but victory, as always, was short-lived. A shell burst near the Corsair's tail, tearing through the stabilizer. The plane jolted violently, alarms screaming, the cockpit filled with smoke. "Mayday! Mayday!" he shouted, coughing. The engine sputtered, then died. The propellers slowed to a stop. Silence. The Corsair began to fall, spinning, dropping fast toward the dark ocean below. Daniel tried to pull up, but the controls were dead. "Not yet," he whispered. "Not yet." The sea rushed up to meet him. He pulled the canopy release and threw himself into the night. Cold wind tore at his face. The parachute deployed just in time. Below, his plane hit the water and exploded in a white flash that vanished almost instantly into the dark. He hit the ocean hard. The water swallowed him whole, freezing, heavy, merciless. He kicked, fought his way to the surface, gasping for breath. All around him, debris floated, burning oil, twisted metal, the remains of what had once been his aircraft. For a long time, he just floated there, chest heaving, waves slapping against his face. Above him, the burning wrecks of Japanese ships lit the sky. The air smelled of smoke and salt. "Hawk, do you copy?" Weller's voice crackled faintly through his waterlogged headset. Daniel coughed, spitting seawater. "Still here, barely. Hang tight. We're sending a patrol boat. Don't move." But the night had other plans. The faint rumble of engines approached. Not American, Japanese searchlights swept the sea. Daniel yanked the radio cord, shutting it off. He ducked under the surface, holding his breath as a patrol boat passed overhead, its lights cutting through the waves like knives. Through the murky water, he could see silhouettes, men shouting, rifles ready. He stayed under until his lungs screamed for air, then surfaced quietly behind a floating crate. The Japanese boat circled once more, then turned away. He waited, minutes, maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning. The sea rocked him in rhythm with his thoughts. When the American patrol finally arrived, he was barely conscious. They pulled him aboard, drenched, pale, clutching a fragment of his Corsair's wing like a relic. The next morning, Daniel woke up in the medical tent. A medic leaned over him, checking his pulse. "Lucky bastard," the man said. "You shouldn't be alive." Captain Weller stood nearby, face lined with exhaustion. "You hit 3 destroyers last night," he said quietly. "Command can't decide whether to court-martial you or give you a medal." Daniel tried to smile, but his lips trembled. "Tell them to make up their mind before the war ends." But Weller didn't laugh. He handed Daniel a folded telegram. It was stamped with the official seal of the U.S. Marine Corps. Daniel opened it, his hands shaking. "Sergeant Daniel Hensley is hereby ordered to cease all flight operations effective immediately pending formal review by the U.S. Naval Command. Equipment modification unauthorized. Violation of Section 32B, effective immediately." He stared at the paper, ground it again. "After all that," Weller looked away. "They're afraid of what you've built." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Maybe they should be." He folded the telegram and tucked it into his pocket. Outside, the engines of other planes roared to life, pilots preparing for another day, another battle. He listened to the sound, the rhythm of survival, and for the first time, it no longer felt like his. The following week, Daniel worked on the ground crew, fixing bullet holes, cleaning barrels, replacing engines. Every plane that returned with scorch marks and blood reminded him of where he wasn't, but one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a convoy limped back from the front. 2 Corsairs missing. One pilot dead. Another wounded, and in the middle of it all, a crate was brought in, the remains of a gun turret, twisted, melted. Daniel stared at it in silence. A new thought formed in his mind, quieter, darker. What if his invention could do more than kill from the air? What if it could protect the ground, the men, the camps? That night, he disappeared into the maintenance hangar again. He set a lantern on the workbench and began taking apart the turret, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, just like before. The war outside never stopped. But inside that tent, something else was being born, something more dangerous than before, and Daniel knew, if the brass wouldn't let him fly it, he'd build it for those still fighting below. The war never slept on Guadalcanal. It only shifted shapes, from fire in the skies to whispers in the jungle. When Daniel Hawk Hensley was grounded, the island didn't go quiet for him. It only grew louder. Every night, artillery thundered from the hills. Mortar flares painted the trees in flashes of white, and between each explosion, there were the smaller sounds, the cough of wounded men, the creak of stretcher boards, the whispers of those praying the next shell wouldn't have their name on it. Daniel walked the airfield like a ghost. His Corsair, the Devil's Breath, sat silent, a skeleton of twisted metal and burned paint. The mechanics called it cursed. He called it unfinished. In the maintenance hangar, under a flickering lantern, Daniel worked. The night was hot, thick with humidity and the smell of oil. His hands were black with grease, his uniform stained with blood that wasn't his. On the table before him lay the remains of a turret, salvaged from a wrecked bomber, mangled, but not dead. He stripped it down to its bones, measuring each component, cleaning the gears, polishing the barrel mounts. The other mechanics avoided him. They said he didn't talk anymore, just worked, muttering to himself like a man possessed. But in truth, Daniel wasn't building for glory anymore. He was building out of guilt. For every Japanese ship he destroyed, there were 100 Marines dying on the ground, ambushed in the jungle, cut down in the mud, calling for air cover that never came. He couldn't fly for them anymore. But maybe he could build something that would. He called it the Reaper's Nest. A ground-mounted version of his aircraft gun modification, designed to hold 2 synchronized .50 caliber Brownings on a rotating base. It would fire faster than any standard emplacement, cool itself through a vented drum system, and be manned by a single operator. A portable anti-air and anti-personnel weapon, born not from orders, but desperation. He scavenged everything, scrap from wrecks, cooling hoses from a downed B-24, even water canisters for the cooling drums. It was crude, ugly, but alive. When he finally connected the last belt and locked the mounting bolts, he stepped back, breathing hard. Looks like hell, said a voice behind him. Daniel turned. It was Captain Weller, his eyes weary but sharp. Maybe hell's what we need, Daniel replied. Weller walked around the weapon, running a hand along its steel frame. This thing of yours, what do you expect it to do? Daniel's voice was steady. Hold the line when nothing else can. Weller studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Test it at dawn. When morning came, a small crowd gathered at the edge of the airstrip, mechanics, gunners, even a few wounded Marines hobbling on crutches. The test range was a stretch of jungle filled with wreckage and old barrels. Daniel climbed behind the mount, adjusted the sights, and signaled to Weller. The captain raised his hand. Fire. The twin Brownings erupted, the recoil rocked the base like a living thing, the barrels glowing, the sound rolling across the field like thunder. In 5 seconds, the jungle was shredded. Trees splintered. Metal tore. The air filled with smoke and flying debris. When the echo finally faded, silence returned, the kind that made your ears ring. The Marines stood there, mouths open. One of them muttered, "Sweet Mother of God." Weller smiled faintly. You just changed how we fight. Within a week, word of the Reaper's Nest spread across the island. Other squads requested copies. Mechanics begged Daniel for schematics. He drew diagrams by hand, taught crews how to weld the mounts, how to balance the recoil. how to feed the belts. Soon, the hills around Henderson Field bristled with them, 20, 30 modified emplacements, all born from one man's defiance, and just in time. On October 14th, the Japanese counterattack began. It started before dawn. The low hum of engines rolling in from the sea, followed by the distant flash of naval guns, then the jungle erupted, artillery rained down, Marines scrambled to positions, shouting, firing blindly into the darkness. The first wave of enemy infantry broke through the tree line, charging with bayonets gleaming in the flickering light. Weller's voice crackled through the field radio, "They're pushing from the north ridge. We need those nests hot, now." Daniel ran from one emplacement to the next, helping reload belts, clearing jams, shouting instructions through the roar. The modified guns screamed in unison, cutting through the charging waves of soldiers. Tracer lines stitched across the jungle like molten veins, turning darkness into daylight. "Hold your fire steady," Daniel yelled. "Short bursts, let the barrels breathe." But the enemy kept coming. Grenades rolled through the mud, explosions ripping through the lines. Marines fell screaming, replaced by others. Daniel reached one nest where a young gunner lay dead, chest torn open. Without hesitation, he jumped behind the mount and took control. The twin Brownings roared under his hands, their recoil hammering his shoulders. He didn't aim anymore. He just fired, at movement, at shadows, at anything that breathed. The air stank of cordite and blood, bodies piled in the mud. Still, the Japanese advanced, relentless, stepping over their dead as if the ground itself demanded it. Then, the unmistakable whine of mortar shells. The nearest nest exploded in a burst of fire and shrapnel. Daniel hit the ground, ears ringing. When he looked up, his left arm was bleeding. Weller crawled beside him, dragging a wounded Marine. "They're breaking through the south line," he shouted. Daniel struggled to his feet. "Then we fall back." Weller shook his head. "No. We hold." Daniel gritted his teeth, slung his wounded arm across his chest, and ran toward the last operational Reaper nest, the one he had built with his own hands. He climbed behind the gun, wiped the blood from his face, and whispered, "Let's see if you still remember how to sing." The barrels spun up again, unleashing hell. Every shot tore into the charging line, the ground erupting beneath the enemy's feet. Smoke and flame filled the air, turning day into night. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the attack faltered. Silence. The jungle was still, and in that stillness lay hundreds of bodies, the price of one man's machine. Weller staggered up beside him, chest heaving. "You did it," he said quietly. "You stopped them." Daniel didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the barrels, glowing, cracked, dripping smoke like they were bleeding. He stepped back, trembling. "No, we just bought time." In the distance, thunder rolled again, not weather, but ships. Weller followed his gaze. "They'll come again." Daniel nodded. "And next time, they'll bring everything." The captain put a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll meet them with everything we've got." That night, Daniel sat alone beside the Reaper. The jungle crackled with the sound of burning trees. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and death. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled telegram, the one that had grounded him. He stared at it for a long time, then tore it in half. The paper fluttered into the mud like ashes. He looked up at the stars, faint behind clouds, and whispered, "Grounded or not, I'm not done yet." By dawn, the silence had turned heavy, the kind that followed after too much death. The jungle was littered with smoke and corpses, and Henderson Field reeked of cordite, fuel, and blood. For the men who survived the night, the line between victory and survival had blurred long ago. Daniel Hawk Hensley sat slumped beside his weapon, the Reaper. The twin barrels still glowed faintly in the morning haze. His bandaged arm throbbed. His throat was raw from shouting. Around him, Marines scavenged what was left, reloading belts, collecting helmets, whispering the names of those who didn't answer roll call. Captain Weller stood at the edge of the field, binoculars raised, scanning the sea. "They're regrouping," he muttered. Daniel didn't look up. "How many ships?" "Enough to finish what they started." Out beyond the reef, faint silhouettes moved in the mist, destroyers and transports, their hulls black against the rising sun. The Japanese weren't retreating. They were preparing. Daniel forced himself to his feet, his movements slow, mechanical. He tightened the sling on his wounded arm and adjusted his sidearm holster. "Then we hit them first," he said. Weller turned to him, incredulous. "With what?" Half our emplacements are gone. We're down to 2 working Reapers. We're out of fuel. Out of air cover. Daniel's eyes didn't waver. We still have me. The captain studied him, that same haunted look he'd seen before on the faces of men who had nothing left to lose. Finally, Weller sighed. You're not flying, Hawk. You're barely standing. Daniel met his gaze. You grounded me once. Don't do it again. By noon, word spread through the camp. A last-ditch counterstrike was being planned that a handful of Corsairs, whatever was still airworthy, would hit the enemy convoy before it reached the shore. It wasn't an order from command, it was desperation, drawn on a map in the dirt by men who knew they wouldn't all return. Daniel limped toward the hangars. His plane, the Devil's Breath, still stood there, blackened and charred, but inside the fuselage, the engine still breathed faintly, waiting that he climbed into the cockpit. The seat was stiff with dried blood and soot that he closed his eyes, inhaled the familiar scent of fuel and leather, and whispered, just one more flight. Mechanic Corporal Rivers approached from behind, eyes wide. Sir, that bird's grounded for a reason. She'll fall apart in the air. Daniel gave a faint smile. Then I'll hold her together. For hours, they worked, tightening bolts, patching holes, replacing torn cables with scavenged wiring. Rivers cursed under his breath as he welded the cracked wing spar. Daniel reloaded the modified Brownings by hand, sliding the belts into place, every link glinting in the light. When it was done, the plane looked more like a ghost than a fighter, blackened, patched, scarred. But alive. As the sun dipped low over the ocean, the pilots gathered at the strip, 5 of them, each wearing the same hollow look. Weller approached Daniel one last time. If this doesn't work, it'll work, Daniel said quietly. Or none of us will be around to complain. The captain nodded slowly, then extended his hand. Daniel gripped it firmly. For the men who didn't come back, he said. Weller's voice broke. And for the ones who still might. Engines roared to life, 5 planes, their propellers slicing through the humid air. The ground crews stepped back, saluting silently as the fighters taxied to the runway. Daniel's hand trembled as he pushed the throttle forward. The Corsair coughed, sputtered, then roared with life. He felt the vibration through his bones, the heartbeat of a dying machine refusing to surrender. Devil's Breath, this is Tower, came Weller's voice through the radio. Godspeed. Daniel smiled faintly. See you in the dark, Captain. The plane surged forward, wheels pounding the dirt, lifting into the sky like a phoenix from ashes. The other Corsairs followed, their silhouettes streaking across the red horizon. Below, the island receded, green jungle giving way to endless blue. Ahead, the enemy convoy loomed, a dark smear of steel and smoke across the water. Targets confirmed, said Lieutenant Harris over the radio. Daniel adjusted his sights, his hands steady. Let's give them hell. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ships almost immediately, red tracers clawing at the sky. Explosions blossomed around them, shaking the planes. One Corsair took a direct hit, spiraling into the sea in a trail of flame. God damn it. Harris shouted. Daniel gritted his teeth. Stay on course. Drop low. They dove through the smoke, weaving between bursts of flak. Daniel's modified guns came alive, twin streams of fire ripping through the deck of a destroyer. Japanese sailors scattered as the ship erupted in flames. Another plane swooped in behind him, releasing its bombs. The ocean leapt skyward, swallowing 2 transports in a single blast, but the return fire was relentless, black clouds of flak tearing through the formation. 2 o'clock. Fighters incoming. Harris yelled. Zeros screamed down from the clouds, machine guns flashing. Daniel rolled hard, the wings groaning under the strain. Bullets tore through the fuselage. Come on, baby, hold together. He muttered. He swung behind one of the Zeros and squeezed the trigger. The twin Brownings spat fury, tearing through the enemy plane's engine. It burst into flame, spiraling down into the ocean below. Another Zero locked onto him from behind, tracers slicing past his canopy. Daniel yanked the stick, diving low toward the ships. The wind roared in his ears. The plane shuddered violently, alarm screaming. He looked at the altimeter, too low, but he saw it then, the largest ship in the convoy, the command vessel, smoke rising from its midsection. He knew what he had to do. Harris, he called over the radio, voice steady. Tell Weller, we held the line. Wait, Hawk, what are you? Daniel cut the transmission. He jammed the throttle forward, diving straight toward the enemy flagship. Bullets tore through the wings. The cockpit filled with smoke, but he never slowed down. Inside, his hands were steady, his eyes calm. He whispered to himself, not a prayer, but a promise for every man who didn't make it home. The ocean rushed up to meet him. The last thing he saw was the ship's deck, a blur of movement, terrified faces, and steel. Then, white light. The explosion ripped through the sea, a column of fire towering into the sky. The blast wave rolled across the water, flipping smaller boats like toys. On Henderson Field, miles away, men stopped and turned as the shockwave hit. A low, rolling thunder that shook the earth. Captain Weller watched from the ridge, binoculars in hand. He saw the plume rising. The mark of one man's final strike. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he whispered, he did it. The radios crackled. No response. Just static. Weller lowered the binoculars, eyes glassy. Godspeed, Hawk. By nightfall, the convoy was broken, half the ships were burning. The rest retreated into the darkness. The island held, but at the airfield, one plane never returned. In the days that followed, the men spoke his name quietly, like a ghost. They told stories of how one Marine turned a broken weapon into salvation, how a single modification changed the tide of a battle, and how a man who refused to stand down gave everything he had, not for medals, not for fame, but for the brothers beside him. On the wrecked airstrip, beneath the stars, Weller stood alone beside the last Reaper nest. He placed his cap on the gun mount, bowed his head, and whispered, "You didn't die grounded, Daniel. You died flying." The waves carried the sound of distant thunder, the last echo of the devil's breath. The sea was quiet again. Days had passed since the sky had burned, and Guadalcanal lay wrapped in a heavy silence, the kind that comes only when too much has been lost. Henderson Field was little more than a scar now, its runways cratered, its hangars skeletal frames against the rising sun, but the flag still stood. Torn, blackened at the edges, it still waved in the wind, stubborn, defiant, alive. Captain Weller walked alone through the ruins of the airstrip. Each step crunched over spent shell casings, fragments of steel, and shards of glass that glittered like frost. Men worked quietly around him, repairing what could be repaired, burying what could not. They'd won, if that word still meant anything. The Japanese convoy had been destroyed before it reached the shore. The enemy had retreated, their assault broken, but in the empty hangar, one space remained untouched, the place where the Devil's Breath had once stood. A small wooden crate sat on the ground, the name, Hensley, Dr., scrawled across its side in faded paint. Inside were a few personal effects, a wristwatch stopped at 1742, a blackened flight glove, a pocket Bible with a single verse underlined. Weller picked it up and read the faint words, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He closed the book slowly and stood there, listening to the wind whisper through the open hangar. Outside, the surviving pilots gathered near the strip, helmets in hand. The chaplain spoke quietly, his voice barely carrying over the soft hum of the waves. When the service ended, Weller stepped forward, holding a small metal tag in his palm, Daniel's dog tag, recovered from the wreckage that had washed ashore days later. He looked at the men, their faces drawn and hollow. He wasn't supposed to fly. That day, Weller began. His voice cracked. He wasn't supposed to build that weapon. None of this was supposed to happen. He looked down at the tag, turning it over in his hand, but maybe that's the point. War doesn't ask permission. It only asks who's willing. He placed the tag on a simple wooden cross driven into the sand. No medals, no fanfare, just the ocean, the wind, and a silence that said more than words ever could. Weeks later, a transport ship arrived to evacuate the wounded and deliver new supplies. Among the crates, a single envelope arrived, addressed to Captain Weller, Guadalcanal Air Group. The sender, Naval Ordnance Department, Washington, D.C. Weller tore it open. Inside were blueprints, copies of the modified gun design. At the bottom, in typed letters, approved for replication. To be designated M2H, Hensley Recoil Mod System. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked toward the sky. Even in death, Daniel's creation lived on, refined, perfected, and soon to be mounted on aircraft across the Pacific. His madness had become doctrine that in the months that followed, the legend of the Reaper mod spread through the Marine Corps like wildfire. New pilots trained with it. Gunners swore by it. They said it could fire 20 rounds per second, enough to cut through the side of a destroyer, enough to change the outcome of a battle. But among the men who'd been there, who'd seen the first one roar to life in the jungle, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a memory, a symbol of a man who refused to stop fighting, even when the war had taken everything from him. Weller was promoted and transferred to a new command in the Solomons, but wherever he went, he carried that pocket Bible in his jacket, and sometimes, when the nights were long and the distant guns echoed across the sea, he'd open it and trace his finger over the verse Daniel had underlined. One evening, months later, as he stood on the deck of a carrier heading north toward Bougainville, a young pilot approached him, fresh-faced, barely 20. "Sir, is it true?" the boy asked. "About the Marine who modified his guns? The one who stopped the convoy alone?" Weller smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "It's true." The boy's eyes lit up. "They say he killed 20 men a minute." Weller's smile faded to something quieter. "He didn't count, son. He just made sure we could." The pilot hesitated. "What was his name, sir?" Weller looked toward the horizon, where the sun was sinking behind the waves, gold bleeding into red. "His name," he said softly, "was Daniel Hensley. But most of us just called him Hawk." The ship's horn echoed across the sea, deep and solemn. Weller removed his cap, held it to his chest, and whispered into the wind, "You did it, Hawk. You changed everything." Far off, a flight of Corsairs roared overhead, their engines growling like thunder, their wings cutting through the clouds, and for a moment, in the wash of their sound, it almost felt like he was there again, laughing over the radio, daring the impossible. The horizon swallowed the last light of day, and the ocean grew calm once more. The war would move on. New battles would come, new heroes would rise, but somewhere in the endless Pacific, the spirit of one Marine still burned, in every gun that fired, in every plane that flew, in every man who refused to surrender. And long after the guns fell silent, when the world finally slept again, the story of Daniel "Hawk" Hensley would remain, not as a tale of madness, but as proof of what a single man could do when courage became his only weapon. The waves rolled gently against the hull, whispering through the dark that a single star broke through the clouds, faint but unyielding. Weller watched it for a while, then turned and walked below deck. Above him, the sky remained, vast, eternal, unbroken, and somewhere out there, beyond the reach of war, a Marine flew on.